The rushing water drowned out her thoughts as Julia Harris stood at the river's edge, her tear-stained cheeks glistening in the late afternoon sun. She had come to this desolate spot along the Platte River with no clear intention other than to escape from her past, from her pain, and perhaps from life itself. The hem of her faded blue calico dress was soaked from wading into the shallows, her boots abandoned on the rocky shore behind her. It was 1876, a hard year in the Wyoming Territory, and Julia had nothing left to lose. "Madam, I reckon that water's too cold for swimming," a deep voice called from behind her. "Come back with me. Whatever's troubling you, dying ain't the solution." Julia whirled around, startled by the intrusion. A tall man sat atop a chestnut horse, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were trail-worn dusty denims, a faded red shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. A cowboy, by the look of him, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. "I wasn't," she began defensively, then stopped. What was she doing? Even she wasn't entirely sure. "It's not your concern, sir." The cowboy dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his size, tying his horse to a nearby cottonwood. "Name's Gabriel Reed. Most folks call me Gabe." He approached slowly, as one might a spooked horse. "And out here, a person standing alone at a river's edge is everyone's concern." Julia squared her shoulders. "I am perfectly fine, Mr. Reed, just contemplating." His eyes, a striking shade of green, studied her face. "Contemplating usually doesn't involve river water up to your knees and a look like the world's ending." He removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair streaked with sun-bleached strands. "My cabin's about 3 miles yonder. I've got coffee that ain't half bad and a stew that'll fill your belly. After that, you can be on your way if you've a mind to." Julia hesitated. She had fled town that morning with no destination, just the desperate need to escape the whispers and pitying glances that followed her since Henry's death and the bank's foreclosure on their homestead. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bundle of possessions. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked suspiciously. Gabe shrugged. "Been riding these parts for 15 years, learned that folks don't end up at river edges on accident. Whatever brought you here, it can wait long enough for a hot meal." There was something in his straightforward manner that disarmed her defenses. Perhaps it was exhaustion or hunger or simply the unexpected kindness from a stranger when the world had shown her so little of late. "Very well, Mr. Reed," Julia said, wading back to shore. "I accept your offer of a meal, but nothing more." Gabe nodded, offering no argument as he handed her the boots she'd discarded. "Fair enough." The ride to Gabe's cabin was largely silent. Julia sat behind him on the horse, holding tentatively to his sides. The landscape, rolled by vast stretches of prairie grass, interspersed with clusters of cottonwoods and willows along the riverbanks. The setting sun painted the western sky in vivid oranges and pinks, a beauty that seemed at odds with Julia's inner turmoil. Gabe's cabin appeared as they crested a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney from which thin wisps of smoke still rose. A corral stood nearby with 3 horses grazing peacefully, and a small vegetable garden was visible on the southern side. "It ain't much," Gabe said as he helped her dismount, "but it keeps the rain off and the warmth in." The interior was simple but orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a table with 2 chairs occupied the center, and a bed stood in the far corner. Shelves lined with books surprised Julia, not what she'd expected from a rugged cowboy. "You read," she observed, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Gabe smiled as he stoked the fire. "Man's got to do something during winter blizzards." He hung a kettle over the flames. "Coffee'll be ready shortly. Stew needs warming." Julia stood awkwardly, suddenly aware of how improper it was to be alone in a strange man's cabin, but propriety seemed a distant concern after all she'd endured. "May I help?" she asked. "Bowls are on that shelf," he replied, nodding toward a simple pine cabinet. They worked in companionable silence, Gabe stirring the stew while Julia set the table. When they finally sat to eat, the rich aroma of the beef and vegetable stew made Julia's stomach growl embarrassingly loud. "Been a while since you ate proper, I take it." Gabe observed without judgment. Julia nodded, taking a spoonful. The flavors burst on her tongue, simple but hearty and satisfying. "This is excellent," ranch cook taught me, said a man on his own needs to feed himself decent or he'll waste away. Gabe broke a piece of cornbread and passed half to her. "Mind if I ask what brought you to that river?" Julia stared into her bowl, considering how much to share. "My husband died 6 months ago. Pneumonia took him in just a week. We had a small homestead north of Laramie, but there were debts I didn't know about. The bank foreclosed last week." The words came out flatly, emotions buried deep. "I have no family here, no friends close enough to impose upon." Gabe nodded slowly. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam." "Julia," she corrected him. "Julia Harris." "Julia," he repeated. "What were you planning to do? Before the river, I mean." She gave a hollow laugh. "That's just it. I had no plan. 26 years old and suddenly without anything familiar to hold on to." She looked up at him. "What about you, Mr. Reed? What brings a man to live alone out here?" "Gabe," he reminded her. "And that's a long story. Short version is I rode with cattle drives for years, saved my money, and decided I wanted a place of my own without too many neighbors." He paused. "Lost my wife and daughter to cholera back in '68. Took to the trail after that." Julia's eyes softened. "I'm sorry." Gabe waved away her sympathy. "It was a long time ago. Pain doesn't go away, but a man learns to carry it." After dinner, Julia insisted on washing the dishes while Gabe tended to his horse. When he returned, he carried her small bundle of possessions that had been tied to her own horse, which had wandered off. "Found this by the river," he said, handing it to her. "Figured it must be yours." "Thank you," Julia replied, clutching the pathetic parcel that contained all she had left in the world. "You can take the bed," Gabe said, unrolling a bedroll near the fireplace. "I'll sleep here." Julia began to protest, but he raised a hand. "I've slept on harder ground for years. One night won't kill me." That night, lying in Gabe's bed, Julia stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams. The strange turn of events left her disoriented. That morning, she had awakened with nothing but despair. Now she found herself in the cabin of a kind stranger who had, quite possibly, saved her life. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in months, she felt a tiny flicker of something that might, with care, grow into hope. Morning came with the sound of coffee being prepared and the scent of frying bacon. Julia sat up, momentarily confused by her surroundings until the previous day's events came rushing back. She quickly smoothed her dress and hair before emerging from the bed. Gabe stood at the small cast iron stove, cooking breakfast with the same quiet competence he seemed to bring to everything. "Morning," he said without turning. "Hope you're hungry." "I shouldn't impose any further," Julia said, though her stomach growled at the delicious smells. "Eat first, then we'll talk about what comes next," Gabe replied, sliding eggs onto 2 plates over breakfast. Gabe surprised her with a proposition. "I could use some help around here. Garden needs tending, cabin could use a woman's touch, and I'm often away checking on cattle." He spoke matter-of-factly without a hint of impropriety. "I've got a small room off the back I use for storage. Could clear it out, make it proper for you. You'd have your privacy." Julia stared at him. "You're offering me employment. You don't even know me." "I know enough," Gabe said. "You're down on your luck, but too proud to just accept charity. This way you earn your keep, have time to figure out your next steps." He sipped his coffee. "Unless you've got somewhere else to go." Julia thought about her options, which were painfully few. She could return to Laramie and seek employment as a housekeeper or laundress, facing daily reminders of her loss. She could try to make it to Cheyenne, where she knew no one, or she could accept this unexpected offer. "People would talk," she said finally. "A widow living with a single man." Gabe shrugged. "Nearest neighbors are 5 miles away. Don't much care what people think anyhow." He met her gaze directly. "I'm offering work and shelter, nothing more. You have my word as a gentleman." There was something trustworthy in his steady gaze. Julia found herself nodding. "Very well, Mr. Reed, I accept, at least until I can make other arrangements." "Gabe," he corrected again with a small smile, "if we're to be sharing a roof, might as well use my name." The first few days established a cautious routine. Gabe cleared out the small storage room, adding a cot, a small table, and a chest for Julia's few belongings. Though cramped, it offered her the privacy she needed. During the days, Julia took over the household tasks, cooking, cleaning, and tending the vegetable garden that had been somewhat neglected under Gabe's care. Gabe typically spent his days checking on his small herd of cattle that grazed on the surrounding land, mending fences, or hunting. He returned each evening for supper, their conversations gradually becoming less stilted and more companionable. Julia learned that Gabe had come west from Pennsylvania after the Civil War, in which he had served with the Union Army. He had worked as a ranch hand, then a trail boss, before saving enough to buy this small spread 5 years earlier. He raised enough cattle to provide a modest income, supplemented by occasional work breaking horses for larger ranches. Why not work for one of the big outfits? Julia asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Seems a hard life out here alone, Gabe considered the question. Had enough of taking orders during the war, and trail drives are a young man's game. He glanced at her. Besides, I value my solitude. Until you invited a stranger to live with you, Julia pointed out, a smile tugged at his lips. Reckon even a hermit gets lonely sometimes. As the days passed, Julia found herself settling into this unexpected life. The work was hard but satisfying. Her hands, once soft from her previous life as a merchant's wife, grew calloused from gardening and washing. Her skin bronzed under the Wyoming sun. And gradually, the crushing weight of grief began to lift, not disappearing but becoming more bearable. She noticed things about Gabe, his habit of reading by lamplight late into the evening, the gentle way he handled animals, how he always removed his hat when entering the cabin out of respect for her presence. He was unfailingly polite, careful to maintain appropriate boundaries despite their unusual living arrangement. One morning, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Julia was gathering eggs from the small chicken coop Gabe had built when she heard approaching horses. Shading her eyes, she saw 3 riders approaching the cabin. Gabe was out checking fence lines and wouldn't return until evening. Nervously, Julia smoothed her apron and walked toward the cabin. As the riders drew closer, she recognized the center man as Theodore Blackwood, the banker who had foreclosed on her homestead. A cold knot formed in her stomach. "Mrs. Harris," Blackwood called as they reined in their horses. "What a surprise to find you here." His tone suggested it was anything but a surprise. "Mr. Blackwood," Julia acknowledged stiffly. "What brings you out this way?" Blackwood dismounted, his expensive boots raising dust as he landed. He was a portly man with a walrus mustache and small, calculating eyes. "When you disappeared from Laramie, there was concern. Then word reached us that Reed had taken in a woman." His gaze swept over the cabin with disapproval. "I see you found accommodation." The implications in his tone made Julia's cheeks burn. "Mr. Reed has kindly employed me as his housekeeper. It's a perfectly respectable arrangement." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Reed always was an unusual sort, keeps to himself, doesn't mix with decent folk." He stepped closer. "Your husband's debts remain outstanding, Mrs. Harris." "The sale of your property didn't cover everything," Julia stiffened. "That's impossible. The deed was clear, interest continues to accumulate," Blackwood interrupted smoothly. "I've come to collect what's owed or perhaps make an arrangement." "I have no money," Julia said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Blackwood's eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "There are other ways to settle accounts. A pretty widow like yourself shouldn't be wasting away out here with a recluse like Reed." One of Blackwood's companions snickered, and Julia felt a flush of anger replace her fear. "I believe you should leave, Mr. Blackwood. I have nothing for you." "I disagree," Blackwood said, reaching for her arm. "I think the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked cut through the air." All heads turned to see Gabe approaching on horseback, his Winchester leveled steadily. "That's far enough, Blackwood," Gabe called, his voice dangerously quiet. "Take your hands off the lady." Blackwood released Julia's arm but didn't step back. "This is business between Mrs. Harris and me, Reed." "No concern of yours." Gabe dismounted, keeping the rifle ready. Julia works for me now, that makes her welfare my concern. His green eyes were cold as he addressed the banker. Whatever claim you think you have, you won't be pressing it here. Blackwood glanced at his companions, but neither seemed eager to test Gabe's resolve. The woman owes money, legal debts that must be paid. Then send the paperwork, Gabe replied evenly. We'll have it reviewed by a proper lawyer, not settled through intimidation. For a tense moment, it seemed Blackwood might argue further, but something in Gabe's unwavering stance apparently convinced him otherwise. This isn't over, Reed, the law's on my side. Maybe, Gabe conceded, but the law isn't here right now and I am, best you ride on. After the men departed, Julia released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you, she said quietly, but I'm afraid I've brought trouble to your door. Gabe leaned his rifle against the porch post. Blackwood's been trying to get this land for years. This is just his latest excuse. He studied her face. Did he hurt you? No, Julia assured him, touched by his concern. But I had no idea Henry still owed money. The foreclosure should have settled everything. Blackwood's not known for honest dealings, Gabe said grimly. We'll ride into Laramie next week, talk to Judge Willis. He's a fair man, won't let Blackwood get away with swindling. Julia felt a surge of gratitude for this man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. Why are you helping me like this? Gabe's expression softened. Everyone deserves a second chance, Julia. I got mine when I found this place. Seems only right to pass that on. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Julia found herself studying Gabe's profile. In the flickering light, the hard lines of his face seemed softened. There was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged exterior. For the first time since Henry's death, she felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with grief. The thought startled her, and she quickly looked away when Gabe glanced up from his book. It was inappropriate to feel such things, especially when he had been nothing but respectful. She was still in mourning, still raw from loss. Yet as the evening wore on, she couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to start anew, not just with a place to live, but with someone to share it with. As promised, they traveled to Laramie the following week. Julia felt strange returning to the town where she had experienced such loss, but with Gabe riding beside her, her anxiety was tempered. They stopped first at the general store to replenish supplies, where Julia endured curious stares and whispered comments. Rumors had clearly spread about her living situation. Mrs. Harris, a familiar voice called. Julia turned to see Margaret Wilson, the minister's wife, approaching with a concerned expression. We've been worried about you, dear. Your sudden disappearance caused quite a stir. I'm well, Mrs. Wilson, Julia replied, acutely aware of Gabe standing a respectful distance away. Mr. Reed has kindly provided employment and accommodations. Mrs. Wilson's gaze flickered to Gabe, assessing. I see. You know, the Parkers were looking for a governess. It would be a much more suitable position for a woman in your circumstances. Before Julia could respond, Gabe stepped forward. Madam, he said, tipping his hat politely. Julia's been a godsend to my humble home. I assure you, everything is proper and respectable. Mrs. Wilson seemed taken aback by his cultured speech, clearly having expected something more crude from the solitary rancher. Well, she said, somewhat flustered, that's good to hear. She turned back to Julia. The offer stands should you ever need it, dear. After she departed, Julia gave Gabe a grateful smile. Thank you, people are quick to assume the worst. Small towns run on gossip, Gabe replied with a shrug. Can't much blame them for wondering. Judge Willis was a tall, gaunt man with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He listened carefully as Julia explained the situation with Blackwood, occasionally making notes. Blackwood's pulled similar schemes before, the judge said when she finished. Hard to prove anything, though. He's careful to keep just within the law. He examined the foreclosure documents Julia had brought. However, this clearly states that the property sale satisfied all outstanding debts to the bank. Any personal loans would have been separate and would need documentation. Henry kept meticulous records, Julia said, but all our papers were in the house when the bank took possession. Judge Willis stroked his beard thoughtfully. Convenient for Blackwood. He looked at Gabe. You're willing to stand as Mrs. Harris's advocate in this matter? I am, Gabe confirmed without hesitation. Very well. I'll send official notice to Blackwood requiring him to produce evidence of these alleged debts. Without proper documentation, his claims won't stand. The judge's stern expression softened as he addressed Julia. In the meantime, Mrs. Harris, you'd be wise to maintain your current situation. Blackwood has influence in town, and I wouldn't put it past him to make trouble. As they rode back to the cabin, the afternoon sun warming their backs, Julia felt lighter than she had in months. Thank you for standing with me today, she said. I'm not used to fighting my own battles. Gabe glanced at her. You're stronger than you think, Julia. You've weathered losses that would break many. His words warmed her more than the sun. Still, it helps to have an ally. More than an ally, Gabe said after a moment. A friend, I hope, Julia smiled. Yes, a friend. The days that followed took on a new rhythm. Julia's initial sense of being a guest or employee gradually shifted as she began to feel more at home in the cabin. She planted more vegetables in the garden, hung curtains she had sewn from fabric purchased in town, and added feminine touches that transformed the bachelor's quarters into something more welcoming. Gabe, for his part, seemed to appreciate the changes. He built shelves for her in the kitchen, brought back wildflowers that he placed in a jar on the table, and even constructed a proper bathtub that could be set behind a screen near the fire for privacy. Their evenings lengthened as summer progressed, often spent on the porch watching the sunset while Gabe told stories of his cattle drive days or Julia shared memories of her childhood in Missouri. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, each appreciating the other's presence. It was during one such evening, with the first hint of autumn crispness in the air, that Julia realized how much her feelings for Gabe had deepened. He was whittling a small wooden horse, his hands moving with surprising delicacy for such a large man. The lamplight caught in his hair, highlighting strands of silver among the brown, and when he looked up to catch her watching him, the warmth in his smile made her heart skip. Something on your mind? He asked. Julia shook her head, suddenly shy. Just thinking how different my life is now from what I expected. Gabe set aside his carving. Better or worse? Different, she repeated. When Henry died, I thought my life was over. I never imagined. She gestured to encompass the cabin, the land, and by extension him. This. Life has a way of surprising us, Gabe said quietly. Sometimes cruelly, sometimes kindly. Julia nodded, gathering her courage. Gabe, I want you to know how grateful I am, not just for the roof and meals, but for... She struggled to find the right words, for helping me find myself again. Gabe's expression softened. You did that yourself, Julia. I just provided the space. Nevertheless, she insisted, you've become important to me, more than I expected. The admission hung in the air between them, its implications clear. Gabe set his whittling knife down carefully. Julia, whatever he might have said was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, both tensed, memories of Blackwood's visit still fresh. Gabe reached for his rifle, which was never far from hand, and moved to the edge of the porch. The moon was bright enough to reveal 3 riders approaching at a steady pace. Stay inside, Gabe instructed, his tone brooking no argument. Julia retreated to the doorway but refused to go further, watching anxiously as the riders drew closer. Relief washed over her when Gabe lowered his rifle. It's just Seth Donovan and his boys, he explained, neighbors from the next valley over. Seth Donovan proved to be a weather-beaten man in his 50s with a booming laugh and 2 strapping sons who clearly took after their father. They had been rounding up stray cattle and were seeking shelter for the night before continuing home. Julia quickly prepared a meal while Gabe and the Donovans settled the horses. Over dinner, the conversation flowed easily, with news exchanged about cattle prices, weather predictions, and local happenings. Heard Blackwood's been making noise about expanding his holdings in these parts, Seth mentioned, accepting a second helping of stew. Been pressuring smaller ranchers to sell. Gabe's expression darkened. He tried similar tactics here recently. Seth nodded knowingly. Man's ambitious, I'll give him that. Word is he's backing that new railroad spur they're planning. Stands to make a fortune if it comes through. Julia and Gabe exchanged a significant look. The railroad would explain Blackwood's sudden interest in acquiring more land, including the property that had been Julia's homestead. Later, after the Donovans had bedded down in the barn and Julia was washing dishes, Gabe joined her at the wash basin. "The railroad," he said quietly. "That explains a lot," Julia nodded. "If Henry's land is along the proposed route. It would be worth far more than what Blackwood paid at auction," Gabe finished, "and this property would likely be valuable too. What will you do?" Julia asked, suddenly fearful that Gabe might be forced from his home as she had been from hers. Gabe's jaw set in a determined line. "Fight if it comes to that. This land is mine, fair and square." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "And I'll help you fight for what's rightfully yours too." The warmth of his hand and the conviction in his voice stirred something in Julia. Without thinking, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. Gabe stood very still, his eyes searching hers. Then slowly he raised his hand to touch her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. "Julia," he said, her name almost a question. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then from the barn they heard one of the Donovan boys call for his father. Breaking the spell, Gabe stepped back, his hand falling away. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice rough. "Morning comes early." Julia nodded, though sleep seemed impossible with her heart pounding so. As she retired to her small room, she pressed her fingers to her lips, wondering what might have happened if they hadn't been interrupted. The Donovans departed at first light, leaving behind fresh venison as thanks for the hospitality. The day resumed its normal pattern, but there was a new awareness between Julia and Gabe, glances that lingered, accidental touches that sent warmth spreading through her. Neither mentioned the almost kiss from the previous night, but it hung in the air between them, a possibility waiting to be acknowledged. Julia found herself wondering what Henry would think of her growing feelings for Gabe. Her marriage had been companionable rather than passionate, an arrangement between families that had grown into mutual respect and affection. Henry had been kind, responsible, and steady, but there had never been the spark she felt whenever Gabe was near. Was it disloyal to feel this way so soon after Henry's death, or would he have wanted her to find happiness again? These questions occupied her mind as she went about her daily tasks. That afternoon, as she was hanging laundry, she noticed a cloud of dust in the distance that indicated approaching riders. Her heart quickened, thinking of Blackwood, but as the figures drew closer, she realized it was a group of men she didn't recognize. Gabe emerged from the barn where he'd been mending tack, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver as the strangers approached. 5 men, all heavily armed, their horses lathered from hard riding. "Afternoon," the leader called, reining in his mount. He was a lean man with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. "Looking for Gabriel Reed. You found him," Gabe replied evenly. "What's your business?" The man dismounted, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the dirt. "Name's Jackson Wells. We're tracking a gang that robbed the Cheyenne stage 2 days back. Trail leads this direction." "Haven't seen any strangers," Gabe said. "Just my neighbor and his sons yesterday." Wells studied the property, his gaze lingering on Julia. "Madam," he acknowledged with a slight nod, "you live here." "I work for Mr. Reed," Julia replied, uncomfortable under his scrutiny. Wells turned back to Gabe. "Mind if we look around? Gang made off with nearly 5,000 in gold. They could be hiding nearby." Gabe hesitated, clearly not pleased with the idea of armed strangers searching his property. "You have a badge, Mr. Wells." "Working with the territorial marshal," Wells said, though he produced no credentials. "His men are checking other spreads in the area." Something in Wells's manner raised Julia's suspicions. His clothes were too fine for a lawman on the trail, and his companions remained mounted, hands near their weapons, watching rather than participating in the conversation. "Perhaps you could show us some identification," Julia suggested, moving to stand near Gabe, "or a letter from the marshal." Wells's expression hardened. "Lady, this is men's business. Why don't you go back to your washing?" Gabe stepped forward, his posture subtly shifting to place himself between Julia and Wells. The lady asked a reasonable question. "I'd like to see some proof of your authority before you search my property." A tense silence followed, broken when one of the mounted men spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "This is taking too long, Jackson. Let's just quiet," Wells snapped, his eyes never leaving Gabe. His hand drifted toward his gun. "Listen, Reed, we can do this easy or hard, your choice." Gabe's voice remained calm, but Julia could sense the tension coiling through him. "I'm thinking you boys aren't lawmen at all. Real marshals would have papers, badges." His hand hovered near his revolver. "I'm guessing you're the gang you claim to be chasing." Wells's face contorted with anger. "That's a dangerous accusation." "Truth often is," Gabe replied. What happened next occurred with breathtaking speed. Wells went for his gun, but Gabe was faster, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. Wells crumpled to the ground as the other men scrambled for their weapons. "Inside," Gabe shouted to Julia, firing again as bullets whizzed past. Julia ran for the cabin, heart pounding, as Gabe backed toward the barn, providing covering fire. Once inside, she grabbed Gabe's rifle from above the door and moved to the window, trying to steady her shaking hands. Through the glass, she could see two men advancing on the barn where Gabe had taken cover, while two others circled around toward the cabin. Drawing a deep breath, Julia raised the rifle. Henry had taught her to shoot for protection during his frequent absences, though she had never fired at a human being. The thought of killing someone, even in self-defense, made her stomach churn, but the alternative, allowing these men to harm Gabe, was unthinkable. When one of the men approaching the cabin raised his gun toward the window, Julia fired. The rifle's recoil slammed into her shoulder, and the man stumbled, clutching his arm. His companion dragged him behind a water trough for cover. From the barn came more gunfire. Julia could see Gabe exchanging shots with the outlaws who had taken positions behind their horses. One of the men suddenly lurched backward, Gabe's bullet finding its mark. The firefight seemed to stretch for hours, though in reality it lasted only minutes. A shot from the barn found another of the outlaws, leaving only the wounded man by the water trough and one remaining rider. They exchanged glances, then simultaneously made a dash for their horses. "Let them go," Gabe called to Julia as she raised the rifle again. "No need to risk more shots." The surviving outlaws mounted hastily and galloped away, leaving their dead companions behind. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Gabe emerge from the barn, a bloody gash visible on his upper arm where a bullet had grazed him. Julia rushed from the cabin, the rifle forgotten as she ran to him. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," Gabe assured her, though he winced when she touched his arm. "Barely a scratch." Julia's relief at seeing him alive quickly gave way to concern about what had just occurred. "Those men, they'll come back with reinforcements." Gabe nodded grimly. "Likely." "We need to ride for town, alert the real law." He glanced at the bodies. "And we can't leave these here." The next few hours were a blur of activity. They loaded the dead outlaws onto their horses, then gathered essential supplies. Julia changed into her riding clothes, a split skirt she had sewn for the occasional rides she took with Gabe, and packed her few belongings. "Will we be able to come back?" she asked as they prepared to depart. Gabe secured the last of their provisions to his packhorse. "I hope so." But those men weren't just random outlaws. The way they approached, asking specifically for me, someone sent them. "Blackwood," Julia said, the pieces falling into place. "The railroad route must run through your land too," Gabe nodded. "And he's not above using outlaws to drive off stubborn landowners. Happens all over the territories." They rode hard for Laramie, the bodies of the dead men draped over their own horses and led behind. The grim procession drew immediate attention when they arrived in town, and soon the sheriff and a crowd of onlookers had gathered. "These men claimed to be working with the marshal," Gabe explained to Sheriff Taylor. "Tried to force their way onto my property, then opened fire when questioned." The sheriff examined the bodies. "This one's familiar," he said, pointing to Wells. "Jackson Wells, wanted in 3 territories for murder and robbery." He looked up at Gabe. "You say they asked for you specifically?" "By name," Gabe confirmed. "And they knew I was alone except for Mrs. Harris." Sheriff Taylor rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Interesting, someone must have sent them after you. Julia stepped forward. We believe it might be Theodore Blackwood, Sheriff. He's been trying to acquire land along the proposed railroad route. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. That's a serious accusation against a prominent citizen, madam. We understand that, Gabe said, but it's not the first time pressure has been applied. Blackwood came to my property weeks ago threatening Mrs. Harris over alleged debts. Judge Willis is looking into those claims. Sheriff Taylor sighed. I'll question Blackwood, but without direct evidence linking him to these outlaws, there's little I can do. He instructed his deputies to take charge of the bodies. You folks should stay in town tonight. The Golden Prairie Hotel has rooms available. As they walked their horses toward the hotel, Julia noticed the stares and whispers that followed them. Their unusual living arrangement had already been the subject of gossip. Now, after arriving together with dead outlaws in tow, they would be the talk of the town for weeks. People will talk even more now, she said quietly. Gabe's expression was unconcerned. Let them. We know the truth of things. The Golden Prairie Hotel was the finest establishment in Laramie, catering primarily to wealthy Easterners and cattle buyers. The clerk at the front desk looked askance at their trail-worn appearance but provided 2 rooms without comment when Gabe placed coins on the counter. Get some rest, Gabe told Julia as they stood in the hallway between their rooms. I'll see about getting us a proper meal brought up. Julia nodded, suddenly exhausted from the day's events. Your arm needs tending first. In the privacy of his room, Julia cleaned and bandaged Gabe's wound. The bullet had only grazed him, leaving a furrow about 4 inches long that, while painful, wasn't serious. Their proximity as she worked, the feel of his skin beneath her fingers, made her pulse quicken despite her fatigue. When she finished, her hand lingered on his arm. I was so afraid, she admitted softly. When the shooting started, I thought. Her voice faltered. Gabe covered her hand with his. I've been in worse scrapes. Takes more than a few outlaws to put me down. Julia met his gaze. I shot a man today. I didn't know if I could. You did what was necessary, Gabe said gently. You protected yourself and me. There's no shame in that. The understanding in his eyes was her undoing. Tears she had held back all day suddenly spilled over. Gabe hesitated only a moment before drawing her into his arms, holding her as she wept against his chest. His hand stroked her hair, his touch comforting rather than demanding. It's all right, he murmured. You're safe now, we both are. Julia's tears gradually subsided, but she remained in the circle of his arms, drawing strength from his solid presence. When she finally looked up, their faces were inches apart. The moment from the previous night repeated itself, but this time there was no interruption, no reason to pull away. Gabe's eyes asked a silent question. In answer, Julia raised her hand to his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. With infinite gentleness, he lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a careful exploration. Then, as Julia responded, it deepened into something more urgent, years of loneliness and longing finding expression in this connection. His arms tightened around her and she pressed closer, feeling the rapid beat of his heart matching her own. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Gabe rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. I've wanted to do that for weeks, he confessed. But I wasn't sure if you were ready, if it was too soon after your husband. Julia touched his face, marveling at the tenderness this strong man could show. I've been thinking about that too, whether it's proper, whether I'm betraying Henry's memory. She took a deep breath. But life is too uncertain, too precious to deny what we feel. Today proved that. Gabe opened his eyes, searching her face. And what do you feel, Julia? That I'm falling in love with you, she whispered, the words both frightening and liberating. That somehow on that riverbank you saved more than my life, you saved my heart. Gabe's smile was like the sunrise breaking over the plains. I knew even then that you were someone special, someone worth coming back for. His hand cradled her face. I love you, Julia Harris. Have for some time now. Their second kiss was deeper, a promise exchanged without words. Only the knock of a hotel servant delivering their dinner separated them, bringing reality back into focus. Over their meal, they discussed what the future might hold. The immediate concern was the surviving outlaws, who might return with reinforcements. Beyond that loomed the larger threat of Blackwood and his schemes. "We should speak with Judge Willis tomorrow," Gabe suggested. "If Blackwood is using outlaws to pressure landowners, the judge needs to know." Julia nodded. "And we should send telegrams to the marshals in nearby territories, inquire about other incidents involving Blackwood or the railroad company." As they planned, Julia felt a growing sense of partnership that went beyond their newfound romantic feelings. They were allies in this fight, each bringing different strengths to bear. The next morning brought unexpected news. Sheriff Taylor arrived at the hotel just as they were finishing breakfast in the dining room. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, pulling up a chair. "We've been tracking those remaining outlaws, found them holed up in an abandoned homestead about 10 miles out." He lowered his voice. "One of them was wounded bad, the one you shot, madam. Before he died, he made a statement. Said they were hired by a man named Blackwood to drive you off your land." Gabe and Julia exchanged glances. "You have this in writing?" Gabe asked. "Signed and witnessed," the sheriff confirmed. "It's not conclusive deathbed confession of an outlaw won't stand up as the only evidence, but it gives me cause to question Blackwood formally." "What about the other outlaw?" Julia asked. "Corroborated the story once he realized hanging was the alternative," Taylor said. "He's in my jail now, waiting for the circuit judge, willing to testify in exchange for leniency." The news was better than they could have hoped for. With an official investigation opening into Blackwood's activities, his influence would be curtailed, at least temporarily. Judge Willis, when they met with him later that day, was grimly satisfied. "I've had suspicions about Blackwood for years," the judge told them. "But he's been careful, using intermediaries for his dirty work." He examined the sheriff's report. This might be enough to finally bring him to account. "What about Julia's homestead?" Gabe asked. The foreclosure was clearly part of Blackwood's scheme to acquire land along the railroad route. Judge Willis sighed. "That's more complicated. The foreclosure itself appears legal, even if the motivation behind it was corrupt. We'd need to prove specific fraud in that transaction." He turned to Julia. "Do you still have any of your husband's business papers?" "Anything that might show the loans were fully paid or improperly calculated," Julia shook her head. "Everything was in the house when the bank took possession." "Which conveniently burned to the ground a week after the foreclosure," Gabe added grimly. The judge's eyebrows rose. "Arson." "Never proven," Julia said. "The official report called it an accident." Judge Willis made a note. "I'll reopen that investigation as well. If we can prove Blackwood destroyed evidence of his fraud, that strengthens our case considerably." As they left the judge's office, Julia felt both hope and anxiety. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, but legal proceedings were notoriously slow, and Blackwood had resources and connections they lacked. "What now?" she asked as they walked back toward the hotel. "Do we return to the cabin?" Gabe considered. It should be safe enough with Blackwood under investigation and those outlaws accounted for, but I'd feel better if we had some extra hands around, at least for a while. "The Donovans," Julia suggested. Gabe nodded. "Seth and his boys would help. And I could hire a couple of hands from the larger spreads men I trust from my trail days." Julia took his arm, drawing comfort from his solidity. "I hate that our home has become a place we need to defend." Gabe glanced down at her, his eyes warm. "Our home." Julia blushed, realizing what she had said. "I meant, that is." "I like the sound of it," Gabe said, covering her hand with his. "Our home." That evening, as they prepared to return to the cabin, a messenger brought an unexpected invitation to dine with Judge Willis and his wife at their home. The judge, it seemed, wanted to discuss matters away from the public eye of the hotel dining room. The Willis residence was a handsome 2-story house on the outskirts of town, with a well-tended garden and comfortable furnishings that spoke of Eastern refinement. Mrs. Willis, a silver-haired woman with bright, intelligent eyes, welcomed them warmly. "Edgar has told me of your troubles," she said as she showed them to the parlor. "Such dreadful business with Blackwood. The man has always struck me as unsavory, despite his pretensions." Judge Willis joined them, offering drinks before dinner was served. Once they were seated in the dining room, he turned the conversation to matters at hand. "I've been reviewing land records for the past year," he said. "Blackwood's bank has foreclosed on 7 properties in the county, all coincidentally along the proposed railroad route." He took a sip of wine. "And in each case, the former owners reported similar tactics: sudden claims of unpaid debts, missing documentation, pressure to sell quickly." "Can anything be done for those people?" Julia asked. The judge sighed. "It depends on what evidence we can gather. Some cases might be reopened if we can prove fraud. Others are likely too far gone, the properties already sold to third parties." "What about Julia's homestead?" Gabe asked. "That's what I wanted to discuss," Judge Willis replied. "The property hasn't been resold yet. It's still held by the bank, which gives us leverage." He looked at Julia. "If we can prove any impropriety in the foreclosure process, there's a chance you could reclaim it." Hope flared in Julia's heart. "What would I need to do?" "For now, help us build the case against Blackwood," the judge said. "The more we can uncover about his schemes, the stronger your position becomes." After dinner, as they prepared to leave, Mrs. Willis took Julia aside. "My dear, I hope you won't think me forward, but I notice there's something between you and Mr. Reed." Julia flushed. "We've become close." Mrs. Willis patted her hand. "Love is precious, especially in these harsh territories. Don't let concerns about propriety stand in its way." Her eyes twinkled. "Though a proper wedding would silence the gossips, if that concerns you." Julia's blush deepened. "We haven't discussed. That is, it's very new." "Of course," Mrs. Willis said with a knowing smile. "But when the time comes, remember that Edgar is authorized to perform marriages." The ride back to the cabin the next day was filled with hopeful planning. Gabe had arranged for Seth Donovan and his sons to join them within the week, and had sent word to 2 former trail companions who might be willing to hire on temporarily. They would fortify the property, remain vigilant, and continue gathering evidence against Blackwood. But beneath the practical discussions ran an undercurrent of deeper feelings. Their declaration of love, followed by Mrs. Willis's gentle hint about marriage, had opened possibilities that Julia had thought forever closed to her after Henry's death. As they approached the cabin, Gabe suddenly reined in his horse, his posture alert. "Smoke," he said tersely, pointing to a thin wisp rising from the direction of their home. They approached cautiously, weapons ready, but the scene that greeted them wasn't what they feared. The cabin stood intact, the smoke rising from a cooking fire where a young Native American woman was preparing food. As they drew closer, an older Native man emerged from the barn. "White Buffalo," Gabe called in recognition, relaxing his grip on his rifle. "Didn't expect to find you here." The man, his face deeply lined with age and weathered by the elements, raised a hand in greeting. "Gabriel Reed, we have been waiting." Julia looked questioningly at Gabe, who explained, "White Buffalo is a Shoshone elder. I helped his grandson during a blizzard 2 winters back." He dismounted, extending his hand to the old man. "This is Julia Harris." White Buffalo studied Julia with dark, penetrating eyes. "The woman from the river." Julia started in surprise. "How did you know about that?" A slight smile touched the elder's face. "The spirits speak. They told me a woman was saved from the water and that danger follows her." He gestured to the young woman by the fire. "My granddaughter, Morning Star, she has prepared food." Over a meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, the latter contributed from their own supplies, White Buffalo explained his presence. He had dreamed of danger approaching Gabe's cabin and had come to offer assistance. The Shoshone still considered parts of this territory their ancestral land, though treaties had pushed them further west, and they maintained a network of information that often surpassed what white settlers knew. "The banker man," White Buffalo said, "he makes deals with bad men. Not just the ones who attacked you, others from the railroad. They plan to take many lands." "Do you know where these men are now?" Gabe asked. Morning Star spoke for the first time, her English clear though accented. 2 days ago, many men gather at old trading post by Split Rock. Railroad men, banker, others with guns." She glanced at her grandfather, who nodded encouragement. "They talk about burning homes, making it look like Indian raids." Julia gasped. That's monstrous. They'd start a war just to steal land. White Buffalo's expression was grim. Would not be the first time. White man's greed has no limit. Gabe's jaw tightened. We need to get this information to Judge Willis. If Blackwood is planning violence against settlers while framing the Shoshone, both your people and ours are in danger. The elder nodded. This is why we came. To warn and to help. That night, as they discussed plans around the fire, Julia was struck by the unlikely alliance forming a solitary rancher, a widowed homesteader, and two Native Americans, united against a common threat. It gave her hope that perhaps understanding between their peoples was possible, despite the bloody history that separated them. Morning Star proved to be a skilled healer, examining Gabe's wound and applying a poultice of herbs that reduced the inflammation. The young woman was quiet but observant, and when Julia thanked her for her help, a friendship began to form across the cultural divide. "You love him," Morning Star said simply as they worked together preparing the evening meal. Julia glanced toward Gabe, who was deep in conversation with White Buffalo. "Yes," she admitted. Though it happened unexpectedly, Morning Star nodded, a smile touching her lips. The best love stories are not planned. They come like summer storms, sudden, powerful. Her dark eyes held wisdom beyond her years. "My grandfather says your spirits were meant to find each other." The idea was comforting that perhaps Julia's journey to the riverbank and Gabe's timely arrival had been guided by something beyond mere chance. The next day brought Seth Donovan and his sons, along with disturbing news. "Riders have been spotted near the Carlton place," Seth reported. "Masked men, heavily armed. Carlton's missus was so frightened she took the children and fled to her sisters in Cheyenne." "It's starting," Gabe said grimly. "Just as White Buffalo warned, we need to get word to the judge." Seth's eldest son, Nathan, volunteered to ride to Laramie with the information. While they waited for his return, they fortified the cabin as best they could, reinforcing doors, positioning ammunition and water supplies, and establishing a watch rotation. 3 tense days passed. Morning Star taught Julia how to use native plants for medicine and food, knowledge that might prove vital if they were cut off from town supplies. White Buffalo showed Gabe traditional Shoshone methods for setting warnings and traps around the property perimeter. The Donovan boys repaired fencing and built additional defensive positions. On the 4th day, Nathan returned with Judge Willis himself, accompanied by 4 armed deputies. The judge looked grave as he dismounted. "The situation has escalated," he announced without preamble. 3 homesteads have been burned in the past week. Blackwood is telling everyone it's Indian raids, but we know better thanks to your information." He nodded to White Buffalo respectfully. "The territorial governor has been notified and federal marshals are on their way, but they're at least a week out." "A week might be too late," Gabe said. "If Blackwood's men are working their way through the valley, we could be next." Judge Willis nodded. "That's why I came personally. We need to coordinate the defense of the remaining properties while gathering evidence against Blackwood and his conspirators." He turned to Julia. "Mrs. Harris, I've also uncovered something about your husband's dealings with Blackwood's bank." Julia's heart quickened. "What is it?" "One of the bank clerks came forward," the judge explained. "Seems he kept copies of certain transactions he found suspicious, including your husband's loan payments. According to these records, your mortgage was paid in full 3 months before Blackwood claimed default." Hope and outrage warred in Julia's breast, so the foreclosure was completely fraudulent. "Entirely," the judge confirmed. "I've issued an injunction halting any sale or development of your property pending full investigation. With the clerk's testimony and documentation, we should be able to restore your ownership." It was the news Julia had scarcely dared hope for. Her home, the place where she and Henry had built their life, might be returned to her. Yet as she looked at Gabe, she realized her feelings were complicated. The homestead represented her past, but her future she now knew lay with Gabe. As if reading her thoughts, Gabe moved to her side. "That's wonderful news," he said, his hand finding hers. "You'll have your home back." Julia squeezed his fingers. "We have much to discuss about that." The conversation was interrupted by a shout from one of the Donovan boys, who was on watch at the edge of the property. Riders coming, at least a dozen, everyone moved with practiced efficiency. The women and Judge Willis took positions inside the cabin, while Gabe, Seth, and the other men spread out to defensive positions established earlier. White Buffalo disappeared into the trees with a speed belying his age. Through the cabin window, Julia watched the approaching riders with a mixture of fear and determination. This time she was prepared. This time she would not be driven from her home without a fight. The riders halted just beyond rifle range. Through Gabe's spyglass, Julia could make out Blackwood himself at the head of the group, accompanied by what appeared to be hired guns and a few men in suits, railroad representatives, perhaps. "Reed," Blackwood shouted. "We know you're harboring Indians. They've been raiding homesteads. Hand them over and we might let the rest of you live." Gabe's response was measured but carrying. "The only raiders around here are the men you've hired, Blackwood. We know about your scheme with the railroad." A murmur ran through Blackwood's men. Clearly, some hadn't been informed of the full plan. "Nonsense," Blackwood blustered. "I'm a respectable businessman who hires outlaws to intimidate landowners," Judge Willis called, stepping onto the porch despite Julia's attempt to hold him back. "A respectable businessman who falsifies loan documents to foreclose on properties needed for the railroad." Blackwood visibly blanched at the sight of the judge. "Willis, what are you doing here?" "Upholding the law," the judge replied sternly. "Something you've shown contempt for." "Federal marshals are on their way, Blackwood. This ends now." For a moment, it seemed Blackwood might order an attack despite the warning. Then, one of the suited men, presumably from the railroad, nudged his horse forward and engaged Blackwood in an intense, whispered conversation. After a heated exchange, Blackwood turned back toward the cabin. "This isn't over," he shouted, though his voice lacked conviction. "The railroad will come through one way or another." As Blackwood and his men turned to leave, a sudden movement caught Julia's eye. One of the hired guns had separated from the group, circling toward the side of the property where Seth's youngest son was positioned. The man raised his rifle, taking aim at the boy's exposed back. Without thinking, Julia grabbed Gabe's rifle and rushed to the porch. "Behind you." She screamed, raising the weapon and firing in one fluid motion. Her shot went wide, but it was enough to alert Seth, who whirled and fired at the would-be assassin. The man tumbled from his horse as Blackwood and the others spurred their mounts into a gallop, fleeing the scene. The immediate danger had passed, but everyone knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Blackwood would return, perhaps with more men, unless he was stopped permanently. That evening, as they gathered around the fire to discuss strategy, Judge Willis proposed a bold plan. "We need to catch Blackwood and his men in the act," he said. "Testimony is good, documents are better, but nothing convinces a jury like witnessing a crime firsthand." "You're suggesting we set a trap," Gabe said. The judge nodded. "Exactly. We let word spread that you've all abandoned the property, fled to Laramie for protection. Meanwhile, we position men here hidden and wait for Blackwood to make his move." "He'll burn the place," Seth predicted grimly. "Most likely," Willis agreed, "but we'll be ready. And this time we'll catch him red-handed." Julia exchanged glances with Gabe. The idea of deliberately placing their home in danger was frightening, but if it meant ending Blackwood's threat permanently, perhaps it was worth the risk. The plan was set in motion the next morning. Seth and his sons departed openly, making a show of loading wagons with household goods. Judge Willis and his deputies rode with them, ostensibly escorting them to safety. White Buffalo and Morning Star also left, though they would circle back through hidden paths known only to them. By midday, the cabin appeared deserted. Gabe and Julia remained hidden inside, having carefully prepared for a siege. Water barrels were filled, food stored, and escape routes planned in case the fire spread too quickly for them to control. "Are you afraid?" Gabe asked as they sat in the dimness, waiting. Julia considered the question. "Yes," she admitted, "but not like before. When Henry died and I lost the homestead, I was afraid because I felt powerless. Now," she reached for his hand, "now I'm afraid, but I'm also determined, and I'm not alone." Gabe brought her hand to his lips. "No, you're not, never again if I have any say in it." The tenderness in his voice gave Julia courage. "When this is over," she said softly, "when Blackwood is dealt with and my homestead restored, I don't want to live there." Gabe looked at her questioningly. "I want to be here with you," Julia continued, if that's what you want too." Gabe's face softened with emotion. "Julia Harris, I want nothing more in this world than to build a life with you." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object. "I've been carrying this for days, waiting for the right moment." In his palm lay a simple gold ring. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've kept it all these years, never thinking I'd find someone worthy of wearing it until you." Julia's breath caught. "Gabe." "I'm not asking right now," he said quickly. "Not with danger on our doorstep, but when this is over, when we're free of Blackwood and his threats, I want to ask you properly." Tears welled in Julia's eyes as she covered his hand with hers, closing his fingers around the ring. "I'll be waiting for that question," she whispered, "and I already know my answer." Their moment was interrupted by a soft whistle from outside, the signal that their allies had returned and taken their positions. Now there was nothing to do but wait for Blackwood to make his move. Dusk fell, then full dark. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Julia dozed fitfully, waking at every small sound. Gabe remained vigilant, his hand never far from his weapon. It was well past midnight when White Buffalo's warning came, 3 owl hoots in quick succession. Riders approaching from the east, Gabe and Julia moved to their predetermined positions. Through a crack in the shutters, they could see shadowy figures moving at the edge of the property. The moon, nearly full, provided enough light to count at least 8 men, Blackwood's tall figure recognizable among them. The men worked with practiced efficiency, surrounding the cabin and outbuildings. Julia could hear the splash of liquid kerosene being poured, and her heart pounded with the realization that they truly intended to burn their home to the ground. "Wait for the signal," Gabe whispered, sensing her tension. Judge Willis had been clear they needed to catch Blackwood in the act of ordering the destruction. If they moved too soon, he might claim he was merely an observer, not a participant. From her position, Julia could see Blackwood gesturing, clearly giving instructions. One of the men approached him, presumably for final confirmation. The crack of a rifle shot split the night Judge Willis's signal. Immediately, Gabe fired a warning shot into the air. "This property is surrounded," he shouted. "Drop your weapons." Chaos erupted. Some of Blackwood's men fled immediately, dropping torches and kerosene cans in their haste. Others drew weapons, firing blindly toward the cabin. From the surrounding trees and outbuildings came answering fire as Seth, his sons, and the deputies revealed their positions. Julia kept her rifle trained on Blackwood, who was attempting to mount his horse. When a shot from one of the deputies spooked the animal, sending it galloping away, Blackwood found himself stranded in the open yard. "Surrender, Blackwood," Judge Willis called from his position. "It's over." For a moment, it seemed the banker might comply. Then, with surprising speed for his bulk, he drew a hidden derringer and aimed toward the judge's voice. Julia fired without hesitation. Her bullet struck Blackwood's shoulder, spinning him around and causing his shot to go wild. He crumpled to the ground, clutching his wound and cursing. The firefight was brief but intense. When it ended, 2 of Blackwood's men lay dead, 3 were wounded, and the rest, including Blackwood himself, were in custody. "You've ruined me," Blackwood spat as Judge Willis supervised his binding. "The railroad will never come through now." "The railroad will come through where the Territorial Commission decides it should," Willis replied calmly. "Not where you've manipulated it to go for your own profit." As dawn broke, the full extent of their victory became clear. Not only had they captured Blackwood and several of his conspirators, but among the papers found on his person was a damning document, a contract with the railroad company promising him a percentage of profits from land sales along the route, in exchange for securing the necessary properties. "This is enough to send him to prison for years," Judge Willis said, carefully preserving the evidence, "and to invalidate any fraudulent land transfers he orchestrated." The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, testimonies, and rebuilding. True to the judge's word, Julia's homestead was restored to her ownership, the fraudulent foreclosure overturned. Blackwood and several of his associates faced multiple charges, from fraud to conspiracy to attempted murder. The Railroad Commission, embarrassed by the scandal, rerouted the planned spur line to follow existing government-owned land where possible, offering fair market value to those few landowners whose properties were needed. The cloud of fear that had hung over the valley lifted as justice was served. Through it all, Gabe and Julia grew closer, their bond strengthened by the trials they had faced together. White Buffalo and Morning Star returned to their people with promises of continued friendship and trade, a small bridge built between cultures so often at odds. On a crisp autumn day, with the aspens turning gold along the riverbanks, Gabe took Julia back to the spot where they had first met. The Platte River flowed peacefully, its surface glittering in the sunlight. "Seems like a lifetime ago," Julia mused, gazing at the water. "I was so lost then." So desperate, Gabe stood beside her, his hand warm in hers. "And now," Julia turned to him, her heart full. "Now I know exactly where I belong." Gabe's eyes crinkled with emotion as he lowered himself to one knee, drawing his mother's ring from his pocket. "Julia Harris, you came into my life when I least expected it but most needed it. You brought warmth back to my home and heart." His voice roughened with feeling. "Will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner, my love for all the days we have?" Tears of joy spilled down Julia's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Gabriel Reed, I will marry you." The wedding took place 2 weeks later at the cabin that had become their home. Judge Willis officiated with Seth Donovan and his family, White Buffalo and Morning Star, and several neighbors as witnesses. Julia wore a new dress of deep blue silk, ordered specially from Cheyenne, and carried wildflowers gathered from the meadow where Gabe had proposed. As they spoke their vows beneath an arbor Gabe had constructed for the occasion, Julia marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of despair at the river's edge to the heights of joy in the arms of a man who had seen her at her weakest and loved her all the same. "By the authority vested in me," Judge Willis proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." His eyes twinkled as he added, "You may kiss your bride, Gabriel." Gabe needed no further encouragement. His kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of all they would share in the years to come. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music, dancing, and food contributed by all their friends. As the stars appeared overhead, Gabe led Julia away from the festivities to a quiet spot near the corral. "I have something to show you," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Taking her hand, he guided her toward the barn where a covered wagon stood prepared for travel, loaded with supplies. "What's this?" Julia asked, puzzled. "Our wedding journey," Gabe explained. "I thought we might visit that valley I told you about, the one with the hot springs, about 3 days' ride west. We could camp, be alone together for a while." He looked uncertain. "Unless you'd rather stay closer to home." Julia's heart swelled with love for this man who continued to surprise her with his thoughtfulness. "It sounds perfect," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "When do we leave?" "First light tomorrow," Gabe said, his arms encircling her waist. "If that suits you, Mrs. Reed." The name sent a thrill through Julia. "Mrs. Reed," she repeated, savoring the sound. "I think that suits me very well indeed." Their wedding journey was everything Julia could have wished for: days spent traveling through breathtaking scenery, nights spent beneath the stars, learning each other in the most intimate ways. The valley with its hot springs proved to be a paradise, a hidden gem known to few white settlers. They bathed in the healing waters, explored the surrounding forests, and made love in the privacy of their tent, each discovering in the other a passion neither had experienced before. When they returned to their cabin 2 weeks later, it was with renewed purpose and deepened connection. Life settled into a rhythm tending the ranch, extending the cabin to accommodate their growing dreams. Making plans for the future in the spring, they planted an orchard on the southern slope near the cabin: apple, pear, and cherry trees that would provide fruit for years to come. Gabe built additional corrals and began breeding horses, developing a reputation for producing mounts with both stamina and intelligence. Julia established a larger garden, growing enough vegetables to preserve for winter and share with neighbors. Judge Willis visited occasionally, bringing news from Laramie. Blackwood had been sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. The railroad had been completed along its revised route, bringing increased trade to the region without displacing established landowners. Julia's former homestead had been sold to a young family from Ohio, with the proceeds deposited in her name at the new bank that had replaced Blackwood's institution. White Buffalo and his people continued to pass through seasonally, trading crafts and knowledge. Morning Star, who had become a dear friend to Julia, announced her engagement to a young man from her tribe and insisted that Julia attend the wedding ceremony that summer. "Your spirits brought you together at the river," Morning Star told Julia as they prepared for the native celebration. "Just as mine brought me to my beloved, different paths, same destination." As the seasons turned, the most joyous news of all arrived. Julia was expecting a child. Gabe's reaction to the announcement was everything she could have hoped for, his strong hands gentle as they cradled her still flat stomach, his eyes filled with wonder and love. "A family," he whispered, "our family." Their daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Reed, was born on a snowy December night in 1877, with Morning Star serving as midwife. She had Gabe's green eyes and Julia's auburn hair, and from her first cry she held their hearts completely in her tiny hands. Life wasn't always easy. The Wyoming Territory remained a challenging place, with harsh winters, occasional droughts, and the ever-present dangers of frontier life. But Julia and Gabe faced each obstacle together, their love a shelter against whatever storms might come. On warm summer evenings, they often sat on the porch, watching Sarah play in the yard that was now bordered by flowering shrubs Julia had planted. Sometimes, Gabe would take out his harmonica, playing soft melodies as the sun set behind the mountains. "You ever think about that day at the river?" he asked once, his arm around Julia's shoulders as Sarah dozed in her lap. "How different things might have been if I hadn't come along when I did." Julia leaned into his embrace, content in a way she had never imagined possible when she stood at that riverbank 2 years earlier. "I believe we were meant to find each other," she said softly. "That even in our darkest moments, something was guiding us toward this life we've built." Gabe kissed her temple, his touch still sending warmth through her after all they had shared. "Then I'm grateful for whatever hand led me to that river and whatever courage led you to come back with me." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Julia gazed at her husband and sleeping child, her heart full to overflowing. From the depths of despair, she had found her way to joy. From the edge of a river, she had journeyed to a life richer and more fulfilling than she had ever dared to dream. "So am I," she whispered, both to Gabe and to whatever fates or forces had brought them together. "So am I."